Right, I've titled my talk today, "The King is Dead, Long Live the King." You know that reference. So King 3 is gone, King 4 is here. Long live the King. Bit about my background. I've had a fairly tortuous career, I guess. I've done all sorts of things. I started off my career with Deloitte. They weren't called Deloitte in those days. That's how old I am. They were very different then. I moved to Barlow's for a number of years, left them, and started in the entrepreneurial space. I've been there for the last close on 30 years. So professionally, I left the profession, went to IT, and then I've been for a while in aviation. I've sat on a number of boards of companies in the aviation space. I've sat on some mining spaces. And I'm now in the space where I've looked at who I am, and I'm moving into executive coaching. So kind of speaking to people, helping people do what they do best to help them perform is what I'm aiming at right now. I came to King because I know a little bit about the Companies Act. I've used it in my professional career, and King's always been there. But this particular one, I've decided to take a closer interest. So what I'm going to take you through today is a fairly high-level overview of what King is and how it works. Here's my agenda for the day. A bit of the history, a bit of the reason for why do we need a new report? So in other words, why the old king died. What's the new king about? Then we're going to talk about fundamental concepts. And the reason I've taken you through this particular way is if you understand these concepts, reading King becomes a lot more sensible. I've struggled through this thing. I've summarized it. It's pretty clear, but if you go straight into the principles, you'll get lost because these concepts are not understood. So that's why I'm spending time there. We won't really get to see the principles. I'll give you one as an example, but we don't have time for all of that. Then we're going to go into the philosophy that underpins this whole strategy of the King Commission. I'll give you a few highlights and maybe we'll have time for an example. So that's what the agenda is today. It's going to be high level. It may be a bit quick. I'm not going to have much time to drill down too much, but I will try and leave some time for questions. And I'll do my best to answer the questions. I'm not an expert on King. I don't think anyone other than the committee who created it are considered experts. It's just been released, but it's a fascinating document. Okay, you may or may not know that it started off with Mervyn King in 1993. He was approached to please draw up, get a commission together and draw up a body of knowledge that describes corporate governance. And since that time, there have been 4 iterations of King. So it's been around for as long as our democracy's been around, and it's been one of the doyens in the industry. Come in, guys. I need to point out that the King Commission, the King Report, has all been sponsored by the Institute of Directors Southern Africa. It's their intellectual property. They're the owners of the product. They're the owners of the concept. But they don't mind me. I'm a member of the IODCA. They don't mind us talking about it. Obviously, they want to spread it far and wide and hopefully make this thing a universally accepted bit of logic. The interesting thing about King is it's not legislated. It's not prescriptive yet. Now, I add that word in yet because I've seen what's coming. I've read the document, and I think it's going to become part of our legislation, not by being promulgated as an act, but by being part of common law. I see a day coming, not too many years hence, where judges, when they're sitting and deciding whether a fiduciary obligation was or was not fulfilled, whether a director did or didn't show due care and skill, they're going to say, well, how do we measure that? Because the Companies Act is not very clear. And you can go into company law, common law, and say, from precedent, saying, well, in this case, they did this. This is a far easier piece of writing to measure. It's very, very measurable. I think we're going to see judges bringing this in and say, well, if you applied King correctly and explained, we think that you did show due care and skill. And that's going to bring it into our legal system. So it's not necessarily going to be an act, but it's going to become part of our legislative system, is my view. The question that begs to be asked is, well, we've had 3 of these iterations. Why do we need a 4th one? What made the need for this thing happen? I think the most overwhelming thing is a 2-word answer. The world has changed. Since 2009, we've gone through cataclysmic change. Let me tell you some of the stuff. And it's been coming for a while, and it's getting worse. We've seen financial instability around the world. The world has become very financially wobbly. From the capital crisis in the USA to the sovereignty crisis to Brexit. These are big issues circling our globe, causing instability. There's massive, as you well know, climate change that's causing other kinds of instability and fears. I mean, I saw the news report from last week. I was here 2 weeks ago, and my mate said, oh, we've got a drought. A week later, I see floods like I haven't seen in Johannesburg in living memory, my living memory. And so you've got to realize that something's happening in the climate. It's not as it used to be. There's a depletion, and we know this, of natural assets like we've never seen before. And they're running out, and that's where the crises are coming from, a lot of them. That we're running out of these natural assets, and we've got to come with alternatives. Here's the one I'm looking around the room, that's probably going to get most of you where it got me. I don't see any people that are what we would call millennials here. We'll talk about them in a minute. But there's been a massive shift in the social media platform. And that shift alone is causing this incredibly interesting, and that's my euphemism for when I don't know what else to call it. Social media has made this thing called radical transparency. And whether you like it or not, that's uncomfortable. Things are now transparent that never used to be. And we have to deal with it. We can't close it. We can't shut the windows anymore. The social media wave has done that, and there's no closing it, no turning back. So it's in the context of these major upheavals and changes that King 4 was born. Oh, I didn't mention, this is what you guys understand, the whole concept of big data. When King 3 was written, I don't think big data had been born. It might have been there, but it hadn't been coined. That phrase hadn't been coined, and certainly the ability of analytics to understand this stuff rapidly and take massive amount of data and to interpret it hadn't yet occurred. So that's causing major change, as you guys well know. And lastly, this whole idea of disruptive technology, that's here to stay. The technologies that are coming into our lives are disrupting the status quo. We talk about artificial intelligence, 3D printing. I've had you just talk about your folks, and you've got parents that are still alive, and you tell them that you can print things in 3 dimensions. You can print biomass in 3D. You can print tissue cells. They just can't comprehend this. That's the disruption that's coming at us. So King 4 has been written with that as a backdrop, to say how do we then as organizations, and I use that word intentionally. We used to say in King 3, companies. We no longer say that. We talk about organizations. It's a broader definition, and I'll talk about that in a minute, to try and make it more applicable. So that's one of the major reasons that King 4 found a need. There was a real need to address some of the issues that these major changes in the world have caused. I looked at the word industrial revolution. And the first industrial revolution was when they discovered steam and made it work. And they had steam engines. Then the second one was when they discovered electricity and made it work and create production in a bigger scale. The third industrial revolution was when they started using data, electronics and information, sorry. And now they're saying that the fourth industrial revolution is here. And that's the advent of this digital revolution. And there's this merging of digital, of society, and even biological spheres are coming together, and it's causing a revolution. One thing we know about revolutions of this nature, there's got to be an enabler, and there's plenty of those around right now that enable the change. There needs to be, it usually comes about fairly swiftly. So any revolution that's happened in this type of revolution comes about swiftly. The third thing is it brings about massive either improvement or change or disruption or all three. That's what these revolutions do. They bring about massive change or disruption or improvement. And fourthly, things are never the same again. It's much like that proverbial wave. If you've ever surfed or watched a surfer, they sit out there for ages and they can see the wave coming. But unless you start to paddle before that wave gets you, it's going to miss you. You're going to miss it. You're not going to catch it. And it's going to come past and you're going to be left saying, and what just happened? I went up, the rising tide lifted me, and I went straight back down, and the other guys caught it and I didn't. So that's what these waves of revolution do. They take those that are ready, they swamp some people that are not, and they leave the rest wondering what just happened. I'm going to show you a video clip. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but it's about the fourth industrial revolution. And there's a couple of points that I'll lift out of the video clip once it's done. I apologize if the sound's a little low. I've turned it up as high as I can, but good news is there is, for those of you that sat at the back, the naughty kids at the back, now you pay the price. You should have come here in the front into the spit zone. I call this the spit zone, where you get wet. You guys at the back, you're going to have to just read, because it's all subtext. So if you've got good eyesight, but if you've got bad hearing and bad eyesight, you're over 40. So come, no, I'm just kidding. Come to the front and here.
We are wondering what is happening to the world. Everything is changing.
The very idea of human being some sort of natural concept is really going to change.
Our bodies will be so high-tech, we won't be able to really distinguish between what's natural and what's artificial.
Inside our own heads is the most complex arrangement of matter in the known universe.
You might ask yourself, can we get to be superhumans?
The original Industrial Revolution was driven by the discovery that you could use steam engines to do all kinds of interesting things.
But that was followed by additional revolutions for electricity and computers and communications technology. We're now in the early stages of the fourth Industrial Revolution, which is bringing together digital, physical, and biological systems.
One of the features of this fourth Industrial Revolution is that it doesn't change what we are doing, but it changes us.
With the ability to visualize brain activity, for example, through a simple consumer-based EEG device, it gives us access to ourselves in ways that we've never before thought possible. It unlocks the black box that is the brain and enables us to really, truly be able to realize an identity that is aspirational.
There's now a scientific foundation for the effects of mindfulness on the brain, on the genome, on biological aging. And when the human mind does know itself, then you get the potential for a new renaissance that restructures itself in terms of our relationship to life, our relationship to the planet, our relationship to work.
We need a different economic model. And by that, I don't mean capitalism versus communism. What I'm talking about is a shift in the system along the lines of the two big changes that happened in the 20th century, Keynesianism, with a much greater focus on health and education and the role of government working with business, and then a reaction against that in late century to neoliberalism, where the focus was on free markets, freedom of the individual, and getting governments out of the way. We need a shift to a new system that will allow us to meet the basic needs of every human on the planet, that will live within planetary means, that will be fairer, and that will be focused as its key goal, not on growth per se, but on maximizing human well-being. And history tells us that a values shift is triggered by creation of a new story about how we want to live.
I see the circular economy as something which fits very closely with mankind's goal to be innovative and creative and to always progress. We can use asset tracking, we can use IT, we can use 3D printing to enable this different economic model to recover materials, feed them back into the economy, and really to decouple growth from the resource constraints we have.
The reason we live in cities is not different today than it was 10,000 years ago. Even if we have got networks connecting us, we still want to have places where we meet in person. So this means the place where we work and the place where we live are much closer to each other, a city where we don't need to have big supply chains in order to produce things, where many things can be sourced locally thanks to 3D printing and robotics. So if we're able to do something to transform cities, to make them more efficient, then the impact can be huge.
Think about the prospect of getting rid of plastics. We must not only be inspired or informed by nature, but actually use natural organisms with which to design products and building parts. Only instead of varying material properties, we're varying biological functionality.
Design is critical today because it's the first signal of human intention. So the question of adding quality to quantity, it isn't a matter of simply circulating things that are potentially toxic. It's circulating things that are safe and healthy for all generations. So the goal is no longer, I want to be less bad, less monotonous, less unsafe, less unjust. It's really about a diverse, safe, healthy, and just world with clean air, clean water, clean soil, clean energy.
Together we are fighting to preserve our fragile climate from irreversible damage and devastation of unthinkable proportions.
If we think about the original Industrial Revolution, it was an energy revolution. I like to think of it as a kind of bookending of a period in human history during which we used fossil fuels, and it worked very well for us for a long time. But now we have to bring that to an end. We have energy technologies that can power our civilization: solar, wind, biomass. So then the question is, well, how do we get grid integration? Maybe the wind is blowing in Denmark, the sun is shining in Germany, and now you can move that electricity through an integrated grid. You can supply energy to everyone who needs it, and you can supply energy at all times.
Walking around, you do see different stuff as far as like the body marriage line. They use a lot of things that help them lift up and move things to the car. You just sit there and, you know, program something, and it has its own set mind to go ahead and do everything. And then as humans, we just come in and take the extra step to help the technology.
It's not the cure-all for everything. There's definitely a lot of things where people perform the operation better, but certainly for the right applications, robotics are a huge improvement for the process.
The prediction of 5 million jobs lost by 2020 to technology is serious, but it's not the main question. Construction, manufacturing, services, public health and education, these industries will still exist. The main question is, what will be the future of work? How will we define work? How will we share the wealth?
From the viewpoint of the labor or jobs, now we really need new education or new training.
We're working with a World in Motion and First Robotics, trying to encourage students from 3rd grade all the way up through the end of high school. We had students make sailboats, and then we had them race them, and so they could see how quickly they could move. And they immediately went back and started to say, oh, I saw what happened, I'm going to go change this or that. And that was 3rd graders.
I just given a prize to a kid of 18 years old that has discovered something really very, very unique. Came up with how to get better productivity and better yields for seeds of corn. And so he basically came with the idea that if you would perforate these seeds, you would get more food. And you think about it and say, but he didn't go to university. So how does he get all that knowledge? And he told me, I mean, I've been watching YouTube since the age of 12, and I'm so interested that I've seen everything about it. I've read everything about it. The world is really open to learning. The thing is, how do you give the incentive to your kids to do that?
It's this ability of digital technology to change outcomes, to truly empower people all over the world that can create a more equitable growth, because I think the world needs that.
Fourth Industrial Revolution has the potential to make inequalities visible and to make them less acceptable in the future, and hopefully to gather and garner political support to take the necessary decision to reduce the gap.
Right, so there's a couple of things, and I think that's an ideal backdrop for King 4, and explains a lot of things. I just want to remind you of a couple of things they said there. Early on in the video, it says there's a shift to a new system that will allow us to meet the needs of every human, that will allow us to live within the planetary means and be fairer and focus on humans as well. That's happening. The issue is, are companies aware of it? Is the way they govern themselves taking that into cognizance? And I think that's the positioning of a King 4 report. I love the one comment that design is the first signal of human intention. I have for a long time believed that nothing exists without it first being a thought. Everything exists by first being a thought. And that's exactly the same thing. So if we're going to change anything in this world, the way our companies are governed, the way our organizations are governed, we have to think. And the thinking is the design, and I think that's what King is doing. It's putting a design blueprint together for people to start to adopt and to think about. Interesting comment, I don't know if you remember, they were talking about the integrated grid for electricity, that they were having a surplus of power here and a lack of power there. And the problem is, well, how do you get the surplus where they don't need it around to there? And that's quite a difficult physical thing to do for them with electricity. But for the data people, well, that's already been done. And the idea people, that's already been done. The ability to move things around the globe is already there. It just needs to be improved upon, it needs to be polished, it needs to be done a lot more efficiently to get the ideas and the stuff around data moving around the planet. And that last thing where I stopped the video, the fourth industrial revolution has the potential to make inequalities visible. And I think that's the biggest revelation for me, that the era and the age that we live in is making inequalities visible. I haven't mentioned them, but there's a group of people called the millennials, and I don't see any in the room now, so we can talk about them. But this group of people is going to be responsible for more dramatic events as time unfolds. Some are already saying that the recent interesting event that happened in the United States on the 8th was as a result of the millennials. That election result was because the millennials think very differently to most people's and the way the polls have expected. I don't know how many polls interviewed millennials, and I don't know if millennials changed their minds that rapidly. But there was a very different outcome to what the polls predicted, to what most people expected. And they think that the millennial and the way the millennials think is attributable to that. So how do they think? Well, millennials are less concerned about the financial crises in the world. They're more concerned about the environmental crises. They're attracted to companies who use not financial capital alone, but all the 6 capitals. Now, I've just introduced you to a term that's very embedded in King, the 6 capitals, and we'll get onto that in a second. So millennials are going to become more and more influential, and they're attracted to companies that think in terms of the 6 capitals. Okay, so let's go into what's new. They're the 6 capitals I just mentioned. We understand the financial capital. That's something we've used to over the years. Financial is usually capital. But the International Reporting Council is saying, no, there's another 5 capitals that we need to take cognizance of. That wasn't necessarily given by the company. They are manufactured, human, intellectual, natural, and social, as well as relationship capital. And all of these capitals have an input into the company's well-being and success. Without those, the company will not succeed. And if you want to succeed, you have to give cognizance and give a return on that capital that was invested. And here's the shift in thinking. So when I first saw this King report, I've got to be honest with you, it looked unreasonable. I thought, this is wacky stuff. It really is lunatic fringe stuff. And I had to read it a number of times, I've got to be frank. And thinking, when I heard it, I said to Howard, I said, this sounds like purebred socialism. I mean, this is, but they're calling it a different name. And then as I read more and more, I began to understand of what the King Commission's trying to do. And I'm trying to bring that across to you today to see what I've seen. And I'm actually quite inspired by it. I'm seeing something that they were trying to get to, but it does take a lot of uncovering. So the first thing was understanding the 6 capitals, because that's one of the assumptions. They then have another telescope that they look at the same problem, and they call it the triple context. So the triple context is this. It's looking at a company. Normally we thought of a company's context as being in the economy. Companies are entrenched in an economy. They're saying, no, you have a triple context. You're entrenched in an economy, you have a society around you, and you operate within an environment. And you have to take those 3 things into account when you do anything in business. And that's one of the underlying new things that's come through in King 4. It's this triple context and the idea of 6 capitals that we have to answer to and report about. Now, what else is new? Well, there's been a shift in the corporate world. So that, based on the 6 capitals, there's now this called inclusive capitalism. So this chap, Laborie, he's from the International Institute of Reporting. And he said, long-term financial performance depends on the efficient and productive management of resources, and listen to this, that are not currently measured by traditional accounting methodology. And I, as an accountant, am the first to say, he's right. Long-term profitability these days cannot be easily seen only in the accounting statements. In fact, audited financial statements are simply not enough. They are not enough to give us the picture anymore. Well, we'll get onto that in a minute. So this inclusive capitalism does the following. It says we've got to look at all the capitals that got us to where we are, that give us our success, and recognize them for what they're doing. There's another shift. So there's a shift from inclusive capitalism. There's a shift from short-term to long-term thinking. Now, as a young accountant, I can tell you I've sat on numerous strategy planning sessions where we do our 3-year forecast or our 5-year budget plan. And that's about as far in the future as we dared look, or we could be bothered to look. That's not going to cut it. If you're looking 5 years into the future, you're not seeing what's coming. And when it does come, it's going to hit, and it's going to hit hard. And it may be more than 5 years out, or it may not be visible, but it is 5 years out. So the shift is from short to longer term thinking to make up for this, and that's what King is trying to get to. And the last thing is this silo thinking has moved into integrated thinking. So instead of thinking of these buckets of things, and in fact even in King 3 it had a sustainability bucket. Talk about sustainability, done. A financial bucket, done. They're saying, no, you've got to think about it as an integrated. It's a holistic approach. It's not a silo approach. So that's what King's trying to do. They talk about a couple of other shifts in the world. You guys know about technology, governance, and security. It's going ballistic out there. Cybersecurity is a major thing. King talks quite a lot about it. And then what King is trying to do is become universally acceptable or applicable. And the way they've done that is they've got several supplements embedded in the King Code that talk to very specific niche markets or very specific applications. There's some examples. They've got a supplement for municipalities, how they need to govern themselves. For non-profits, retirement funds, state-owned entities, and then the smaller business. So they've got applicability. The accusation in the past or the criticism was, well, how do I apply this? It's such a broad code. They've now brought it down to, if you're a municipality, here's one for you. If you're a retirement fund or something similar, read this here. And there's very specific principles embedded in there. They've also changed their phraseology. They don't refer to a board. It's a governing body. They try to make it not a company because they want it to apply to governments, to municipal departments, to any organization, non-profit. They want it to be very applicable. And I was surprised at the amount of worldwide coverage that this report got and the amount of accolades this report is getting from the world community. Really, really impressive.
I have a question on that.
Sure.
So, number of startup companies, that do not necessarily follow the conventional sense in terms of how businesses are formed. So, where would they fall within the spectrum? Because I think small enterprises are quite specific, but startups are very different.
Mm. So I think you're right. I think that the small startup company may be a tier below a small enterprise, but reading what a small enterprise is expected to do, and we'll get into the point I'm going to make now, but I'll make it now. The other shift is, in the past, King's Commission said, apply or explain why you're not. And in that instance, a small startup would say, well, I'm too small, so I'll explain why I'm not doing it. That's changed. Now it is apply and explain. Explain how you've applied. So a small startup would say, well, look, I'm so small as one man, but here's what I'm doing. And maybe it's only a start, and they do talk about proportionality. It's one of the phrases in there. How you must take this and make it appropriate, proportionize it to your size or enterprise. So if you're not a multi-million-dollar business, then don't apply the whole King. Apply what works, but explain why you're doing it. You've got to give thought to it. So I think there's a great degree of application even for a startup, but it's as I said earlier, it's not prescriptive yet. And a small startup isn't going to be taken to court for fiduciary breach. But when you get bigger and you have shareholders and you've got all sorts of other things and other currents happening, I think that's when it's going to become very applicable. But thank you for that question. There's a kind of answer. Okay. Oh, I think I missed one there. Yep. Apply and explain. That was my next point. So that's what's changed. You're going to have to apply and explain. And it starts, incidentally, 1 April 2017 for years beginning. So you must start thinking about it so that your financial report and your applications and the way you do it can start to be seen. Okay, moving on to the fundamental concept. So the definition of corporate governance. That's a fundamental concept, obviously, in King. And they define it simply as ethical and effective leadership. That's what they say. It's ethical and effective leadership that the governing body does to achieve these outcomes. And the 4 outcomes are an ethical culture, good performance, effective control, and legitimacy. So let's just take a step back. Ethical and effective leadership. Ethical is about the being. There's 2 aspects here, being and doing. Ethical is integrity, competence, accountability, fairness. So they're saying leadership must be all of those. They must be or try to be or become that. But there's also not just being, there's a doing as well. There's an expectation, there's things you must do. And that's the effective leadership. So there's an expectation. This is a very practical piece of writing. I think, in essence, corporate governance is nothing more than a leadership issue, a leadership question. If you boil it down to its simplest ingredient, it's a leadership issue. And therefore, that's really good news. Because leadership issue in this context is something that can be learned. You know, people say leaders are born. Sure, if you're maybe a leader of a country or that kind of leader, those are few and far between. But in this context, leadership is a skill that can be imparted, imputed, and can be learned, can be taught. So that's fantastic news. So if leadership is at the heart of this, then John Maxwell's comment, which I'll show you next, is pretty apt. He said, leadership ability is the lid that determines a person's level of effectiveness. So he sees leadership as a lid, and if you have a low leadership capacity, your effectiveness is limited. And he went on in his writings to say that it's the same application for organizations, companies, departments. No department can rise beyond the level of the leader. That leader forms a lid. We don't have to look too far in this country to see that really, really aptly in true color. It's happening all around us. We see issues and incidents where leadership lack is causing a block. So increase the leadership and corporate governance becomes a lot easier to achieve. Okay, so moving on now, you need to understand the philosophy that King 4 was written in. So the first philosophy that helps understand this, and when this sank in, I began to understand the rest, and it became a lot easier. The first philosophy is organizations are an integral part of society. We are part and parcel of society. Why? For without society, as a business, you have no function. If there's no one to sell to, what do you do? If there's no one to hire, what do you do? If there's no material you can buy to make your product, what do you do? You only have your existence because of the society in which you operate in. And that's new thinking for very, very traditional capitalists. Like, wow, okay. We're an integral part, and with that being integral, we're affected by society, and we in turn, as an organization, affect society. So we depend on societies for, as I said, customers, employers, employees, training. We need them. The African phrase Ubuntu is exactly this. It's I am because you are because we are. It's that sense of community, and in that finds identity, and that became to make a lot of sense. Was there a question here?
They're not local. I mean, I can have people working in India and all these other places. My business is just local here to me. So how do we define that?
Okay, I think that, and that is certainly a different spin on it, but no matter how much your society is international, there's a certain amount of society that is local. Your telephone service, all the other services that you have to buy locally, you're impacting. There must be some people that you're employing locally or some local content. So to that extent, you're part of society. If you can, and a business that doesn't have any local society could easily operate in the mountains somewhere. As long as you had electricity and a connection, yes, that may be a slight exceptional on the one extreme, but by and large, the majority of businesses has a lesser or greater extent as an impact on and is impacted by society around it.
So maybe by extension, what I'm trying to get at is that surely I have a responsibility to the people in India that I'm using, to the various other places. Has my society now diversified?
I would think it has. I would think that when you understand what they're saying, and it's not prescriptive, but they're suggesting that your thinking needs to say, if I'm employing people and I've got a whole bunch of workers in India working for me, that is the society that's part of who I am as a company. I need to understand that and govern myself correctly in their interests. And we'll get on to stakeholders in a minute, and they're part of the stakeholder group. So we must govern ourselves so that, let's use a radical example. If I'm employing people in India and we're building shoes, I hope this is not too close to the bone, and we're making shoes, and I discover that those people are 13 years old or younger, I've got to do something about that. I can't just say, well, that's not my society, that's Indonesia. No, no. If I have say, I must do something about it. That's what King is saying. That's what the Commission is suggesting. Okay, the next thing is, linked to this, is this idea of corporate citizenship. We as organizations we have a citizen status which confers on us as a company or an organization obligations and rights towards our environment. So yes, we have the right to consume things, but we also have an obligation to make sure it's sustainable. And there's a lovely definition of sustainability in King. And I'll get onto that in a minute. The next thing that's really important to understand is the stakeholder inclusive. They use that phrase a lot. Let's talk about that for a second. What are stakeholders? Not to be confused with shareholders. A shareholder is a subset of stakeholders. Stakeholders are a very broad group, and they define two main aspects: external, internal. Who are the internal stakeholders? Employees, governing body, management. Those are all internal stakeholders. They have a stake in this organization. External people, and King goes on to say this, and listen to this. This is who they define as external. Obviously, customers, they're external. Suppliers, they're external. Civic society, government, they define that as stakeholders because maybe the taxes that they derive and that type of thing. So they've defined stakeholders, and they're saying stakeholders must be included in your thinking. Not that they dictate, but consider their needs and consider what it is that they require if you're going to find profitability. And we need to govern ourselves and then report on these things. So the governance is one thing. The reporting is a completely different thing. And that's a whole different kettle of fish. But you guys, I'm sure, will handle that for us all. I've got my faith in you guys. And then sustainable development. That's one of the last fundamental philosophies. They define sustainability as development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the future generation's ability to meet their needs. So yes, meet your needs, but do not compromise future generations' ability to meet their needs in future. So drink the water, but make sure there's enough left for the next guys. Eat all the apples, burn all the coal, but leave some. And if you can't, then don't do it. That's the implication. So the sustainable things coming right into the center of King. Okay, moving on to the second last thing, some of the highlights. So integrated reporting was there in King 3. It's still there, but it's now linked to this whole thing of integrated thinking, bringing the capitals, bringing the triple context into play, bringing all of this into play. Our reporting now is a much broader integrated reporting concept. They talk about the governing body has certain roles, and this is really important to understand. They're looking at the governing bodies, and they're saying, governing bodies, you steer and you set direction. You approve policies and planning. So you not only steer and set direction, you approve the policies that come out of that, you oversee and you monitor that, and you provide accountability on the performance of that. Now that's very, very onerous if you think about it. If you're on a governing body or you're a board, this is a pretty scary piece of writing if you're a board member. And I'm looking at some of my board positions and I'm saying, whoa, this is going to be interesting, because it's a long way from reality to where this thing is, and we've got to try and get it there. We've always known that directors have a huge responsibility, but King makes it very clear how much the responsibility is. Now, one can delegate, and that talks about delegation, establishing of committees, and they give you guidelines, but that doesn't exonerate you from being responsible. You can delegate and say, do it, plan it, I'll monitor it, but you are ultimately, as a board member or a governing body, responsible. So that's part of the thing. The composition, independence is still there, but they've gone a little step further. They said independence in appearance. Now, it's not, it was, you must have an independent or enough board members that are independent. Now they're saying you must appear to be independent. Sadly, a lot of the organizations out there at the moment are nowhere near independent in appearance or in reality, and that's got to happen. The board, or the governing body as they call it, has got to be knowledgeable, skilled, experienced, and diverse. That's what they're suggesting, and for good reason. To accomplish this, you need to have that knowledge, that skill, and that diversification within the board. I've mentioned that they're quite okay to delegate to committees, but that's not abdication, that's delegation. You're still responsible. They suggest evaluating boards twice, every second year. In the previous King, it was every year. I've got to be honest, I don't know how many of you guys know of a board that gets evaluated even every 2 years. I don't know of one. On all the boards I've ever sat, we've never had the board evaluated as frequently as every 2 years. So that's quite a change, and I think it's a great thing. You know, I was chatting to someone this morning about, hey, I know some churches that should have boards evaluated, and I started chuckling because that'll throw the cat among the pigeons. Can you imagine, eh? Risk and opportunity, they've brought in this concept of risk being up or downside risk. We always think of risk as downside. They're saying, no, risk can be upside. Risk can bring opportunity. Risk can bring positive results. But address it and look at it through your risk committees and make sure you understand what the risk is or isn't going to do for you. And then this is an interesting one, technology and information. And I've put it that way because that's how the report puts it. It's technology and information. It's not information technology. They split the two, and they see a distinct difference in the two. You have technology and you have information, and they're both critical, and they come up often in this report. The whole idea of information, and you cannot be a technologist and not sit up and take note of this writing, because it's got a lot of things that we have to consider. And then the last thing, which is really important, and I think we're going to see this more and more, is what they call shareholder or stakeholder activism. They're promoting shareholders in particular, but stakeholders as well, to be active in holding companies accountable for good governance. And shareholders particularly because they've got law behind them. As a shareholder, you've got the Company Act that supports you. Be active. Insist that your companies act in accordance with good practice. And you're going to see that in the companies that you guys work in. The shareholders, the stakeholders are going to get very active. And you're going to see changes in this space. Okay, I'm not sure how we're doing for time. I do have an example. Whoa, plug in. Well, there's my answer. We don't. There's my answer. So I won't. I do have. Okay, for questions. So I'm going to shut this thing down. I did have an example of one of the principles, the principle 12, but I don't think we're going to have time. Any questions, folks? Let me see if I can answer some questions if you have any. Some frowns around the table. I'm around the room.
Just an issue of appearance.
Yes.
Appearing. Could you just give us an example of an independent director who does not appear to be independent, and one that is independent appears?
Okay. Did you hear the question at the back? Okay, you can hear it at the back. I don't have to repeat it. Okay, the question was, what's an example of appearing to be independent? Can you give an example of a director that is independent but doesn't appear to be, and one that appears to be but isn't? So, okay, no names, no pactuals. I won't mention which company I'm talking about now. But there was a company that I was on the board of. I was a director. Let me just say that. I mustn't give too much away here. I worked with one of the other directors, but I didn't own shares. Technically, you know, they look at, are you a shareholder? Do you transact with that company? Do you have any business dealings with that company? And the answer to all those was no, I'm not a shareholder. I don't do business. I don't do anything with that company. I sit on the board and advise. But because I actually worked with one of the other directors who was a shareholder. I was not independent, but I appeared to be. And when I said to them, I said, do you have any shares? Do you have any contracts? I said, no, no, no. Oh, well, you're independent. That's appearing to be independent, but I'm not, because I worked with somebody who was a big shareholder, and maybe subconsciously I might make a decision that might favor him as a shareholder. One of the things I didn't mention is they're very clear in King 4. Directors or governing bodies may not make decisions in any other interest other than in the company's interest. Now that stands to reason, but they elaborate. They say it may mean that you have to make a decision that's not in the shareholder's interest. And that's really, really interesting. They are coming out and saying, hey, shareholders are only one source of capital. There's 5 others. And shareholders are not the company. Your obligation fiduciary is to the company, not to the shareholder that put you there. So you must operate in the company's best interest. Now, to think of an example for the corollary of that, someone that appears to be independent, no, isn't independent but appears, well, I don't know. I hope I answered the question. That was a, okay. There was another question? Another question? No. Okay.
So one of the things that a lot of people say is that it's very nice to be a CEO of a company, get it to the point where you can milk it nicely, sell, take your shares and move. Is there anything in King 4 that says, hang on a minute, you're only going to get your money 3 years from now because we need to see that your decisions took the company forward?
No, there's no specific, and they'll never do that. But what they've done and what can be argued, not after the event, after the event's too late, but any company coming up and they want to act correctly, they'd say, you know what, we are not going to declare dividends, or we're only going to declare this much, and we're going to put in some protection mechanism, there it goes, protection mechanisms to protect the company from corporate raiders, from abuse of directors, etc. We're going to put in protection. And one of the things they do ask is they say, show us how you've documented your procedures. So you say, well, and that would be a question. How do you prevent this company from being abused by directors declaring dividends or salaries too big? And they do speak a lot about salaries, incidentally, and remuneration. You say, well, here's my policy. And here's where my independent board has done this. And here's why it's fair, because not only are we giving these executives this kind of pay, we've looked at our internal stakeholders being staff and union people, etc., etc. We think this is a balanced view. So if you follow King correctly, I think a lot of those risks are diminished. Not gone, but diminished. Thanks for that question. Good one.
So maybe to both you and Howard, looking at the fact that corporate governance or data governance is just a subset of corporate governance, do we look to the governing bodies to then push down the requirements, or do we as data governance stakeholders, do we, you know?
Okay. I'll tell you what King says, and I'll tell you what I think you should do, and they're different. King says it's the governing body's responsibility, and they should either do it themselves, but it says obviously they don't have all the skills. They should then ask management to prepare, and then they come back and approve of the plan. That's what it says. So it should be initiated by the governing body, delegate it down, get the answer, and approve it and say, this is our new policy, and put it on the board. Reality tells me that's not going to happen. Reality tells me proactive people in the space below should say, hey, board, look at this. We suggest you make this what you apply. We suggest you adopt this, because if you don't, at least you can use this to say, well, you've got something. Because without this, you have nothing, and then you could be found very wanting. You could look very, very guilty if asked, where's your document? So be proactive. I think it can only help. It's not, I don't think it's going to be viewed. If I was on a board and our IT or data people came and said, listen, here's a proposed plan. Would you guys accept it? Do you want us to explain it to you? I'd be delighted. You know, I've chaired some boards, and I would, if we had that proactivity, I'd be thrilled. In fact, I'd be looking for, from them, people, more board members. You know, I'd like want to pull them up. So be careful you don't get promoted to the board, because it's not rosy up there. Now, we have principles, and we have recommended practices. So the principle is maybe the theory, and the practice is the doing. Principle 12 reads, the governing body should govern technology and information in a way that supports the organization setting and achieving its strategic objectives. So answers your question directly. The governing body should govern technology and information, split the two, in a way that supports that organization setting its own and achieving its strategic objectives. So there is the overarching principle, some of the recommended practices. The governing body should assume responsibility by setting direction for how information should be approached and addressed. Now, if they can't do that, they must delegate that to someone that can help them. But it's very specific. So, governing body, you must assume responsibility for setting direction on how information, very specific, should be approached and addressed. Whew. I don't know of any boards that can do that yet. There may be a few. Governing body should approve that policy. So, ask for it, come back and approve it. Third one, governing body should delegate to management the responsibility to implement and execute effective technology and information management. There has to be this interaction. Principle 12, remember, when you read this thing, Principle 12 hits it pretty hard for this group, this audience.